You can renew your passport online in 10 minutes. You can pay a parking ticket from your couch. Somewhere in a government building right now, a form is being processed by a person who has never met you and never will, and the system still works. That's not nothing. That's one of the rarest things a civilization can build. A machine made of strangers that runs itself without anyone in charge having to personally know your name. Rome built that machine first, and it ran for over 500 years. Then in the space of about a century it didn't. Legions that had never lost a war started losing. Cities that had stood for centuries were abandoned. The most sophisticated logistics network on the planet just stopped delivering. And the strange part is there was no single day it happened. No signing of a paper, no final battle everyone remembers. Rome didn't fall. It leaked for 200 years until one day people looked around and realized it was gone. So let's start at the top, at its peak. In 117 AD, under the Emperor Trajan, Rome controlled about 2 million square miles, stretching from Scotland to the Persian Gulf, from Portugal to Iraq. An estimated 60 to 70 million people lived inside its borders, something like a quarter of the entire human population on Earth at the time. A courier on the Roman road system could carry a message 50 miles in a day, on roads so well engineered that some of them are still drivable today, 2,000 years later. There was one currency, one legal system, one army protecting all of it. For a Roman citizen in the 2nd century, the world and the empire were basically the same word. And here's the thing that gets lost. Rome wasn't fragile. It wasn't a house of cards waiting for one gust of wind. It survived plagues, civil wars, bad emperors, assassinations, and entire legions getting wiped out, and it kept absorbing the damage and rebuilding. Something that resilient doesn't collapse from one cause. It gets worn down by several at the same time, each one making the others worse. To understand how something this big came apart, you have to look at what was actually holding it together in the first place. Rome wasn't just an army with good roads. It was a bureaucracy, a genuinely staggering one for its time. Tax collectors called publicani operated across the whole territory. Grain from Egypt and North Africa was shipped to feed the city of Rome itself, which at its peak held over 1 million people, a population size no European city would match again for more than 1,000 years. None of that happens by accident. It happens because thousands of anonymous officials, clerks, and soldiers all trusted the same set of rules enough to keep showing up and doing their jobs. That trust is the real machine. Coins, courts, and roads are just the parts you can see. And when trust breaks down, even briefly, the parts don't stop existing, they just stop working together. That's the story of Rome's decline, not the machine getting destroyed, but the trust holding it together quietly draining out piece by piece for 2 centuries. The first crack was money. Rome ran on silver coinage, the denarius, and for centuries that system worked because the silver was real. But an empire that size is expensive. Soldiers need pay, grain needs subsidizing, borders need garrisons all the time, everywhere, forever. So emperors did what governments under financial pressure have always done, they started cutting the silver with cheaper metal. In the reign of Nero, around 60 AD, the denarius was about 90% silver. By the 270s it was closer to 5%, basically a silvered bronze coin pretending to be money. Prices exploded. A measure of wheat that cost a few denarii in the 1st century cost hundreds by the 3rd. Soldiers stopped trusting their pay. Merchants stopped trusting the currency. You cannot run a 2 million square mile logistics operation on money nobody believes in. The Emperor Diocletian tried to fix this head-on in 301 AD with the Edict on Maximum Prices, a law that set legal ceilings on the cost of everything from bread to shoes to skilled labor on penalty of death. It didn't work. Merchants simply stopped selling goods at a loss and black markets absorbed the trade instead. You can legislate a number onto a coin. You cannot legislate trust back into it once it's gone. Then the throne itself became the problem. In the 3rd century, during a 50-year stretch historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, Rome had at least 26 different emperors. Most died violently. Some ruled for only a few weeks before a rival general had them killed and took the title himself. One emperor, Gordian III, took the throne at age 13. Another, Valerian, was captured alive by the Persian king Shapur I in 260 AD, and according to Persian sources was kept as a human footstool until he died in captivity, the only Roman emperor ever taken prisoner by a foreign enemy. Think about what a run like that does to an institution. Every ambitious commander with loyal troops now had a reason to march on the capital instead of the border, because the fastest way to power wasn't good governance, it was mutiny. Loyalty in the legions started shifting away from Rome, the abstract idea, and toward whichever general was currently paying them and might make them rich. The empire wasn't just fighting external enemies anymore. It was fighting itself on a loop, decade after decade, and every civil war pulled soldiers and resources away from the frontier at exactly the moment the frontier needed them most. And while Rome was busy with all of that, the border itself started to give. For centuries, the frontier along the Rhine and Danube had been a kind of pressure valve, Rome pushing outward, tribes pushing back, a rough and bloody equilibrium that both sides understood. But starting in the 4th century, something changed on the other side of that line. A nomadic confederation from Central Asia, the Huns, began moving west, and they were pushing entire peoples in front of them like a wave, entire nations displaced and looking for somewhere to go. In 376 AD, tens of thousands of Gothic refugees showed up at the Roman border, not to invade but to ask for asylum from the Huns behind them. Rome let them in and then mismanaged it catastrophically. Roman officials in charge of the resettlement reportedly overcharged the starving Goths for food, trading dog meat at extortionate prices, and the situation curdled into open revolt. 2 years later at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, those same Goths destroyed a Roman army and killed the Eastern Emperor Valens himself, one of the worst military defeats in Roman history, and Rome never fully recovered the manpower it lost that single afternoon. The wall wasn't holding back an army anymore. It was holding back a migration, and there was no coin cheap enough or emperor stable enough to fix that with force. Rome tried to adapt. Diocletian split the empire in two, east and west, in 285 AD, because one man ruling that much territory had become logistically impossible, a decision that essentially admitted the empire had outgrown the idea of a single ruler entirely. The eastern half, richer, more urbanized, better defended with its capital at Constantinople, would go on to survive for another 1,000 years, eventually becoming what we now call the Byzantine Empire. But the western half kept absorbing the worst of the frontier pressure, the worst of the economic collapse, the worst of the internal chaos, all while getting less and less support from its wealthier eastern counterpart. By the early 5th century, the west was effectively being triaged. Provinces like Britain were quietly abandoned. Around 410 AD, the Roman government sent a letter to the cities of Britain telling them to look to their own defenses because Rome could no longer spare the troops. It wasn't one empire failing anymore. It was one half slowly being left to sink so the other could stay afloat, and everyone on the ground could feel it happening in real time. In 410 AD, a Gothic king named Alaric did something that hadn't happened in 800 years. He sacked Rome, not the frontier, not a border town, the city itself, the one the entire empire was named after. It wasn't even the killing blow. The West staggered on for another 66 years after that, but it was the moment people across the Mediterranean understood something had fundamentally broken. St. Jerome, writing from the Middle East when he heard the news, said the light had gone out of the whole world. That's not military analysis. That's a man watching an idea die in real time from 1,000 miles away. The city itself recovered, rebuilt, kept functioning. But something about the psychological weight of Rome as untouchable was gone for good, and empires, like people, don't function well once they stop believing in their own permanence. By 476 AD, there wasn't much empire left to fall. A Germanic general named Odoacer removed the last Western emperor, a teenager with the almost cruelly ironic name Romulus Augustulus, echoing both the city's mythical founder and its first emperor, and didn't even bother replacing him with another Roman. He just didn't. No new emperor was crowned in the West. The office that had run half the known world for 500 years quietly stopped existing, and almost nobody at the time wrote it down like it was a big deal, because by then, it wasn't news. It was just the last domino falling in a chain that had started collapsing a century earlier. So here's the full picture. It wasn't barbarians at the gate, not really, not as the whole story, even though that's the version that gets remembered. It was the money going bad first, so the state couldn't pay for what it needed. It was the throne becoming a prize fought over by generals instead of a stable seat of power, bleeding out resources in endless civil war. It was the frontier buckling under pressure from migrations Rome didn't create and couldn't stop, driven by people fleeing a threat from a continent away. It was an empire so big it split itself in two just to survive, and then let one half absorb the damage meant for both. Every one of those problems made the others worse, at the same time, feeding into each other for nearly 200 years. Until the weight was simply too much for any single institution to carry. It was the frontier buckling under pressure from migrations Rome didn't create and couldn't stop, driven by people fleeing a threat from a continent away. It was an empire so big it split itself in two just to survive, and then let one half absorb the damage meant for both. Every one of those problems made the others worse, at the same time, feeding into each other for nearly 200 years, until the weight was simply too much for any single institution to carry. You live inside systems today that feel just as permanent as Rome must have felt to the people living in it. The currency you use, the passport you carry, the roads, the grid, the institutions that process your existence without you ever having to think about how any of it actually works. It's easy to assume things that big, that established, are built to last forever. Rome lasted 500 years doing exactly what you're doing right now, assuming tomorrow would work roughly like today did. And for a long time it was right, until slowly and then all at once it wasn't.